Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Welcome to this short session where we'll have a look at the King's Indian and my book that's coming out for Quality Chess in a couple of weeks' time. Some of you might have seen it already on the Chessadble course. It's the same material, but it's been edited and some added conclusions in there as well. I started by putting up this puzzle for you guys to consider. There's already the correct first move. This is my pet variation of the classical variation with knight bd7. We'll have a look at both knight bd7 and knight c6, which is the main move. Knight bd7 has the advantage of being much less known and less concrete theory, so it's a bit easier to outplay your opponents, but the play is slower. I'll go into slightly more detail about it shortly, but first let's solve this puzzle. Well done, Hua Chen, and I think there's also another correct, at least a draw. Oh, sorry, Rayo. Rayo, is that how you pronounce it? Okay. So yeah, the problem with the last move of rook fe1, it looked like white is just trying to keep maximum control of the pawn on e4. But we do have another idea. We've just played h6. Meaning this bishop is rather short on squares on e3. And so, yeah, if I... now let's see if I've got this technical side done correctly. Can you now see a new board? Did that work okay? So we'll play through. This is how the position actually arises. Here, I actually recommend the move order knight bd7, which has the advantage of cutting out quite a lot of white tries, the Petrosian variation, the Gligorich, and the exchange variation, which is something that I don't think is actually as scary to play against as a lot of people think. It's a long way from forced draw, but still it's nice to avoid it if you can. But I play both move orders. And so with queen e7, the idea is to put some pressure on this pawn on e4. You're not actually threatening to take on d4 yet, because we have some problems with the knight jumping into d5 and our weak pawn on c7. But it's definitely, we threaten to take on d4. So the most common move is to defend it. And here, white is trying to delay playing d5 with a closed structure. But h6 looks like it's just a waiting move, but in fact, after rook e1, knight g4, and this bishop is very short on squares. As people have written already, let's try and move things so that you can't see the solution. Don't want the right tab to have. Maybe I can just close the tab. For now. Yeah, sorry. So white never wants to lose this dark squared bishop, especially on an open board. Our bishop is just going to be so strong on g7. In general, the King's Indian, we're quite happy to sacrifice a pawn if it means that we get this uncontested dark square bishop. You'll see it's one of my favorite expressions in the whole book. So the bishop drops back, but now, yeah, there's some issues. You can take on d4. In fact, white's best try here is probably to take with the rook and just offer the exchange. But of course, everyone takes with the knight. In practice, I've had this quite often. And let's leave this position up for a moment. We have a very nice tactic exploiting the fact that the rook on e1 is actually going to end up undefended. It has a couple of problem pieces here. It's sort of hard to believe when we've got a limited number of attackers ourselves, but white is just uncoordinated for now. And yeah, we sacrifice the knight. Knight takes f2. I believe that Yannick Pelletier fell for this many years ago, a very strong Swiss grandmaster, and he tried an interesting move here of knight f5, which I also cover in the book. But most people are going to take this knight. But now white's in a lot of trouble after queen h4 check. Yes, exactly. White put all his pieces on central squares. Doesn't look like there was any risk at all. And that's why I think that you're quite likely to get this trap. And white keeps cropping up in my games. So white has the decision to make now. Going back to g1 is probably the most straightforward to refute. We can take this knight on d4 with check, and the problem is if white recaptures, then the rook is hanging on e1. Here we've collected a pawn, but it's even worse than that for white because his king is just so weak. King h1, then we can play bishop e5. We're threatening mate on h2 and h3, queen g3, for example, and white's king just isn't surviving here. So king g1 is quite easy to refute. King f1 is slightly trickier. This was played against me by at least a couple of players. I think a strong German grandmaster played king f1 against me. But yeah, nice spot. We can still take on d4. After it takes queen f6, and we fork king and rook. So again, we're going to be exchanging a pawn now. So those two moves are rather easy to refute. g3, I think, is harder. It's worth remembering this one. First of all, we grab a second pawn. Now there's not that many options for white here. Going back with king f1 is just going to run into some... Yeah, Dennis Wagner, thanks. I thought it was Dennis, but I wasn't 100% sure. But yeah, my strongest opponent who fell for this trick. But yeah, with king on f1, bishop h3 mate is going to be unavoidable. So we can just move the knight out of the way and the mate will be coming. Going forward with king f3, allowing knight e5 check. Yeah, Dennis Wagner, the German grandmaster. But king e3 is the best try. And I can't remember if it was this position that I couldn't figure out how to do it over the board without the setting. But yeah, nice spot, Theo. It's a pretty move. Yeah, we're seeing it popping up from a few people now. h5, very pretty move. Again, it's sort of astonishing that we can just waste another tempo with h5, but the threat of bishop h6, followed by knight e5 mate, is just too strong. The king is trapped in the center of the board, and this is just completely lost for white. Finally, there's king forward to e3. This was played against me last time I had the position. And I think the first time as well, when I messed it up in a rapid game. I thought for a few minutes here and couldn't find the kill. Theo's already got the first move, but let's see if we can calculate this to the end. h5, Wendy's interesting again. I think the knight f3 is an additional defense, although bishop h6 looks very strong. I'm trying to remember now. h5 looks so logical, but I think it may even be the move that I played myself. But there was one problem with it. And maybe it was moving the bishop f3, and then the king can drop back to e2. We'll still need to see slightly further of getting the first couple moves right in the notes. Knight e5 is another good try. But again, maybe white is in time with bishop. I think his idea here is probably play bishop f3 and then king back to e2. And it's going to be a bit harder to get his king on e2. Yes, Theo, nice solution there. Wendy, I'm trying to figure out why that one doesn't win. It looks convincing to me. That suggestion was queen g5 check. After king f2, the same trick with bishop takes d4. Let's have a look at that for a moment. Queen g5 check. King f2. There is also king f3, although that looks ridiculous. Take on d4 and queen h4 check. Probably this is also very strong. Because and maybe you can continue with g3. If you go going back to f1, again fails to the same with queen f6. Now it's queen to h2 check, king e3. And the king slowly runs to safety. I think if we wait to move, then knight f3 is also going to be played. So yeah, we've had some correct solutions here. Bishop takes d4, check. Now white can't take with the rook, as the rook on e1 hangs, so we can take it. And so take with the king. Now queen f2 check. If the king drops back to d3, then we have knight e5 check, and we can take on c4 check for starters. But we also have mate in 1, which helps with queen f4. Yeah. But it looks like with bishop e3 that white is developing his pieces with tempo. But we're just in time here with check. King has to go back, knight e5 check, and knight takes c4 check, exploiting this pin along the second rank. So we collect the bishop, and in fact, we're going to win the exchange after that. So we're completely winning here. So this trick is well worth knowing against rook fe1 as it crops up. So it's one advantage of playing knight d7. We'll have a quick look now at what you're most likely to get with knight bd7. And then we'll move on to a game from the Mar del Plata with knight c6 as well. So we have our usual moves. So this is a classical variation of the King's Indian. There are a few different variations, the fianchetto, the h3 lines, Makhanagov variations. There's some uncertainty about when is and when isn't the Makhanagov. The Gligorich, where they delay castling and choose to play bishop e3, and the Petrosian, where they push the pawn in the center as well. But we're playing the same setup. More or less these 5 moves against anything that white will play. And then we can adapt accordingly. So we'll have a look at these moves. Now, with the knight on c6, there's a lot more pressure on the pawn on d4. And that means that d5 is played almost automatically. There are other moves, but d5 is played most of the time. But with the knight on d7, white can be more patient because we're not attacking it. Oh, okay, good night. Sorry it's too late for you, but yeah, you'll see it later. So yeah, the problem with the knight on d7 is it doesn't attack the pawn on d4. But the big advantage is that once the white plays d5, we'll see a game of mine where I won very quickly in this structure. We can put our knight on a much better square on c5. We attack the pawn on e4 for starters, and we'll play a5 to cement the knight so it won't get pushed away. So we're gaining time, and the knight is just much better on c5 than on the usual e7 square. So white should not play the d5 move, although they often do because they're following the set pattern that they know in the main line with knight c6. But bishop e3 is the most common move. And now I like queen e7, putting a bit of pressure on this pawn on e4. We just saw queen c2 followed by rook d1, rook e1, with white trying to keep the center flexible. But in practice, you get d5 played either here or after queen c2. And so this structure is very important if you want to play with knight bd7. Compared to the main Mar del Plata variation lines that we'll see shortly, our play is a bit slower on the king side. We haven't started attacking yet. We haven't even pushed the f-pawn. But instead, we're trying to create some bind on the queen side with this pawn on c5, making it much harder for white to break through. The c4, c5 break is really common for white against our king's Indian, and what we need to be watching out for is this invasion along the c-file. Some c5, knight b5, swap the pawns, and knight into c7 can be very scary, especially if we've pushed the pawn from f7. Yeah, white can also exchange. Do you mean exchange here immediately with en passant? It's a critical line, which actually Anishkiri played against me. Just briefly, this taking on c6, bc, and then b4. These positions are double-edged. We have to be a bit careful, because if white does have time to play b5 and get an outpost on d5, we can be very passive. But we're in time with, thanks to the pressure on this pawn on e4, to get our pieces ready to break with d5 ourselves. And so I go into detail about this, but it's a critical try we have to be ready for. If you're worried about this, then you can start with c6 here, d5, c5. When you're basically half a tempo behind, the queen is better on e7 than it is on d8. But it doesn't change so much. But I don't think we need to worry about it. You just need to know what to do. But taking on c6 in general has been very rare for me. White has normally played the usual King's Indian moves of just sort of blindly playing for the b4 break. So maybe knight e1 to d3, play b4. That pawn we're probably not going to take. We're nearly always wanting to play b6 to keep our formation with the pawn on c5, blunting white's attack. The idea is that with the pawn on c5, it's going to be very difficult for white to get in at all on the queen side. And our king side attack is still coming. Normally I play with king h8, knight g8, and then get f5, and our counterplay coming in. An advantage of having that on g8 is that we can go bishop h6 to exchange off these dark square bishops. Or at least we can threaten to, and white spends some time to deal with it. So these positions are quite interesting strategic battles where the stronger player will nearly always win because all the pieces are still on the board. There's nothing direct. Yeah, well, d takes c6, but knight g4 and f5 can be a plan. You just have to be a bit careful when you play knight g4 sometimes. If it's not actually winning this bishop on e3, so the knight might be a bit loose on squares. So on bishop g5, f6. And here I'm trying to remember which way was more annoying. Probably you just come back to d2. It's possible to go to bishop h4 as well. You have to be careful with f5, especially in these lines with knight d7. The knight should be more active on d7 than, for example, on e7, but we have weakened the e6 square. So here I'd be a bit worried about knight g5, attacking our knight, but more importantly, threatening to jump in with knight e6. This is really the main thing that we have to watch out for. Good question, Ian, but it doesn't really work. We can take, just quickly go back. For example, e5 here. The problem is that the pawn is not going to actually be able to remain on the board here when we exchange. He can play e6, and I had this as well in one game, where our structure is slightly ugly, but we're a pawn up and we'll be in time to regroup here. with knight e5 and even knight to c6 and into d4 is one good plan. But yeah, I would say that you're most certainly against a prepared opponent. If you play this line, then you're very likely to reach this position, or perhaps with the queen on c2. And it's, yeah, just very interesting. I've had very good practical results here. I think it's much easier for black to play. We've got our plan of king h8, knight g8, keep the queen side closed. We'll see one example where I'm playing an unprepared opponent. In an Irish weekend tournament, Banratti. I played a slightly unusual move order, provoking e4 and playing a modern, but I can't remember why now I chose that move order. But we soon got back into the normal stuff. And I played the knight bd7 move order. And here he played the automatic move, if you're not really sure of your Kingsidian theory, of d5. Time to attack that pawn on e4, which was defended, and now an important move, a5. We can't afford to wait here, because white is threatening to play b4 himself, which would gain time for his queenside expansion. In these classical lines, white is nearly always one attacking over on the queen side. He's going to try breaking through on the queen side before we get to mate him on the king side. So it's always more fun for black because we're the ones playing for mate. And if white crashes through and we crash through, then clearly we win because the prize is higher. We're playing for mate. But still, here we should not allow him to accelerate his play with b4. So we play a5. And, okay, white has a few different moves that have been played against me. We won't go into the alternatives here. We'll just see what he did. Knight d2. Overprotecting the pawn on e4. It's a bit slow. Now the pawn on e4 is defended adequately. There's no need to attack it again. The plan of king h8, knight g8 is also possible, but here I decided just to get on with it immediately with knight e8. We're getting ready for our attack. A good question, Jakob, of whether it's worth buying the paper version of the course. I think, obviously, I would be very happy for people to purchase both. But if you have the Chessadble course already, then you might prefer just to keep using that. The advantage of having a book is, well, obviously, people prefer using a book sometimes, and you can take it with you. This has been edited fully, and I've also written conclusions to every chapter, but the analysis is the same in the Chessadble course and in the books. Thank you, Jonathan. And yes, Mike, just the problem, if we just rewind a few moves, is in this structure, white does have to worry about e takes d4 almost every move, whether this pawn on e4 is going to be safe. In general, I only play ed4 concretely, but if it wins the pawn on e4, or at least if we can put a lot of pressure on it, or if white is committed to h3 at some point. The reason is that this pawn on e4 is probably going to be defended by playing f2, f3 after ed knight takes. So hypothetically, it's a slightly strange move here. But after h3 and exchange knight c5, now white doesn't really want to play f3 anymore because it's really weakened the dark squares. In particular, this pawn on the square on g3 is really vulnerable. Cheers, Jonathan. Happy to be here too. And now we've got ideas of jumping the knight into g3, bishop e5 and queen h4. And the attack comes very quickly. The pawn on h3 is a huge weakness. With the pawn back on h2, then white keeps his position together. So a lot of the time, we're really waiting for h3. And for example, in this line with the trick with rook f1, knight g4, where we played h6, if white follows suit with h3, then it would be time to take the pawn on d4. But we'll go back to this one. So yeah, I stop b4. He played natural moves, but they're just a bit too slow. So I'm playing for f5. Now white's plan here is to play the b4 break, but it takes a lot of time. So he tried b3, which is the typical way to do it. Playing a3 immediately looks more natural, but for one thing, there's not a threat yet, because a rook on a1 is hanging after b4, ab, ab. But for another, after we play a4, the only way white can now play b4 is to create this weakness, but with the pawn exchange. And here there would be various good moves, but for example b6, so we can recapture this way. And white does have a passed pawn on a3, but it's not very relevant. It can get to a5, but it can't get any further. So he won't, and we're not going to allow an endgame here. So he'll push the pawn to a5, and in the meantime we'll play f5 and knight f6 and start attacking over on the king side. But we could also ignore a3, and it would likely transpose back to the game. So time to get on with it. f5. As I said, b4's not yet a threat because the rook is hanging on a1. So we can continue our plan. Put pressure on this pawn on e4. In general, what we want to do is provoke white into playing f3 here to defend the pawn before we close the king side. There's a couple of reasons for it. One, for example, he played f3 here. Okay, I waited a move with bishop h6, a slight subtlety. But one reason is that, say f4 here, that when we get the pawn to g4, we'll be crashing through immediately because the pawn is on f3. It's a hook there. The second is that in some positions, not actually here, but let's say he passes with, I don't know, rook b1. If we played f4 here, then this bishop on e2 stays alive. There are some variations where white will be able to put his bishop on g4 in exchange for these bishops. This bishop on c8 might not look like much. We often leave it on c8 for the whole game, but it's actually really important. Without the bishop on c8, it's really difficult to crash through. We'll see a couple of examples of that later on, if we get to them. So he played f3 to defend this pawn on e4, and f4 is natural, but I waited, exploited the fact this knight on d2 is on a bad square. The downside, of course, of playing f4 is that our bishop on g7 then is not going to be a good piece for a long time. It's blocked in by all our own pawns. So first, I've got the bishop outside the pawn chain. Once come to e3, where it's attacking and also just an active piece. He probably should play knight db1 and exchange off these bishops. But there's a couple ways of doing this now. We could play the usual pawn storm with f4 and g5, or we could take and, for example, a4, just creating some weakness over there. But I can't take with the knight because the e4 pawn is hanging. And now knight g4 and the queen is coming in. And we have a very strong attack. And white's pieces look rather ridiculous over here on the queen side. But still, that was better than another slow move with rook a2. He's getting ready for b4. Now probably I should play the check. I shouldn't give him a second chance. But I played knight h5. And he should take the second chance to exchange these bishops. Although it's still horrible. Instead he tried rook d1, but now check. And at this point I was fantasizing that I might win this game without a single exchange. Which I don't think it's ever happened in any of my games. It'd be incredibly unusual to have all of the pieces still on the board. Yes, Rio. I think I should. It was more accurate to start with bishop e3 check here. Maybe and then knight h5 or then f4. They'll probably come to the same thing. And here, yes. Good question, Wendy. It's a move that you should be looking at in all of these King's Indian positions with knight g3 check. It does look very strong here. But the problem is that white is just in time. I think this was the point of putting his rook on d1. That this was my threat. But yeah, now the knight is coming to h2 and blocking our check, annoyingly just in time. But don't worry, this is the plan I'm going for still. With f4, knight g3 check is a big threat. So you've got the right idea. Because now we'll recapture with the pawn, and there won't be this defense to bring the knight round to h2. So we tried knight f1. Now decided there was no need to exchange these bishops. Got a nice strong attacking piece here. And I found the check. And yeah, I really hoped he'd resign at this point, but unfortunately he took my knight. Now queen h4 mate is a huge threat, which he didn't deal with. And he resigned because it's mate next move. So my opponent here was 2150, so a very decent level opponent, but he didn't know really what to do against this knight d7. Played a couple of slow moves, and my attack just came far too quickly over on the king side. So yeah, I dedicate the first few chapters of the book to this knight d7, my pet line. But then I also look at the proper stuff, the theoretical Mar del Plata. And let's have a look at one of my games there now. And I'll try and compare the differences in the two lines. Hello. Yeah, you're right there. b4 never happened in that game. White didn't actually get anywhere at all with his queenside attack. That's the problem with this d5 there, that it's just too slow. So we looked at knight d7, and now we'll look at knight c6. So this is the main move. On a plus side, our play is much quicker here with knight c6. We're attacking the pawn on d4, so white can't really wait anymore. For example, I think if white plays, let's just have a random waiting move h3, then we can already take on d4, and then take this pawn on e4. If white takes that knight, then we're ready to capture on d4 and win a pawn. And if he takes on c6, we can take on c3, and after all the exchanges, we're a pawn up as well. So that means that white needs to react at this point. Bishop e3 isn't that sensible at this point because of knight g4. If white wants to play that way, he should really have done it without castling kingside. It's much more flexible. But it could transpose. But by far the main move is d5. So here we see a downside of putting the knight on c6, that a knight ends up on e7 rather than that beautiful c5 square. It's not great here on e7. For now, it has no squares it can go to, but it might come in useful later by jumping from f5 or more likely g6 to h4 and getting some attack going. So the battle lines are already drawn here. White is going to be the one attacking over on the queen side. He has a few different ways. The immediate b4, the bayonet attack, or moving the knight from f3 to e1 or d2. Other main moves. White is really trying to get in c5 and play attackers down the c file. The pawn on c7 is often quite a big weakness as well, or the square on c7 if the pawns are exchanged. So often we're going to put our rook on f7 to defend across the 7th rank to stop a knight jumping into c7. Sometimes the knight is coming to c7 to win the exchange, our rook on a8, but that is a minor problem for us. We're often quite happy to sacrifice lots of material. But a more major problem is the knight jumping into e6 when we played f5. We really don't want this exchange of bishop for knight. It kills our kingside attack and also means white has a big outpost on d5. So those are the main two plans. We're going to juggle slowing down this plan of entering on c7 and playing the c5 break with our kingside attack. I'm sure you've all seen the classic King's Indian games, or at least diagrams from them, where white's king gets mated with this pawn pushed to f5 and a huge pawn storm. So this game I'm showing is against young Danish grandmaster Jesper Tubo. That's from the European Team Championships in November last year, where England-Denmark, that we won 2.5, 1.5. But seeing this game, you could see that any result might have happened. This was a very classic King's Indian fight. If you like this kind of position as black, then the King's Indian is for you. Some people will feel it's a bit too random, and that's understandable. At this point, I should say that I blunder a whole piece in this game, but I managed to beat a 2600 anyway, just showing the complexity of the King's Indian. So knight e1 is probably the main line these days, other than the bayonet attack, but it's played more often. White's putting the knight on d3 most of the time. It's a useful square to help the c5 break and combining attack and defense. The knight gets out of the way as well, so that when we put pressure on pawn on e4, White is able to play f3 to defend it. So we shift our knight. This time, king h8, knight g8 doesn't make so much sense because that knight on e7 would quite like the g8 square. But the advantage is that we have the d7 square, but before there was a knight there. So we're going to play f5 against more or less anything. So the knight jumped around, and f3. There's been some big theoretical debates in this position about whether White should start with f3 or start with bishop d2 to try and provoke us into forcing us to play knight f6 to attack the pawn on e4 and then playing f3. It used to be considered that bishop d2 was much more accurate. Sorry, but yeah, there's a couple of things. That's right there, Rio. That one thing is that bishop d2 fe is possible. I don't recommend this in the course because it's a bit dry for my taste, but I think it equalizes. White has an outpost on e4, we've got an outpost on d4. We'll try knight f6 to exchange these knights. Knight jumps in, bishop will come out to f5. I think we're fine. That's one advantage or disadvantage of playing bishop d2. The other is that often White is playing without moving that bishop at all now and just leaving it on c1. Sorry. And so f3 is the more common move these days. So we close the queen, close the king side with f4. Now our plan is to push this pawn to g4. We'll probably do that by supporting it with knight f6 and h5. So b4. White's plan is to push over on the queen side. We both ignore each other's plans and just systematically get on with it for a while. Starting with knight f6 is generally better than h5. It's a bit more flexible. One point is that White often wants to play knight b5, but if he does that too early, we'll be able to play g4 without needing any support. Because after f takes g4, we can take the pawn on e4. Against the bayonet attack b4, we won't cover that this evening, but I had a couple of games in my last tournament there. I lost to Boris Gelfand, who prepared a dangerous line, which I believe I've neutralized now, but it was a good practical attempt, and I defeated Maxime Lagarde, a strong French grandmaster. I was playing a5 immediately. So here, White continued with a4, and I played h5 in this game. Just as a brief sidetrack myself, I had to get this position against Alireza Firouzja, currently number 2 in the world, in a rapid game from the Champions Tour last year. And there I chose king h8. We won't worry too much about the theoretical point here. The moves are quite similar. Rook f7 is this weird subtlety that looks bizarre if you're not used to the King's Indian. But the point is, well, twofold. One is to defend across the 7th rank, because we're very concerned about knight jumping into c7. So when we play knight g6, we're controlling the square on c7. The second is that we're also allowing this bishop to drop back to f8, and then our rook can swing probably to g7 to support through g4, and sometimes we'll play h5 and even go to h7. So the rook is actually very good on the 7th rank. Now knight f2. Moving that again is strange, but white is trying to stop g4 for as long as possible. So I got ready to get it in, move the bishop out of the way, so I can play rook g7 to play g4. Now this is not a way that any of your opponents will play, I imagine. It's a very computer-esque way of playing with king h1 and g3, something that the last generation of computers flagged up as a possible plan. I'm not sure it works particularly well here, but I think you have to be a super strong player to judge correctly. Probably you just need to be a silicon player to play king h1 and g3. You have to figure out whether you're going to get mated in the process. In fact, it just didn't work in this game. I'll continue playing the usual moves. Either as it closes the queen side. Now, unfortunately, I can't really play b6. I'd be happy with the queen side completely closed, but after ab, I can't recapture with the a pawn because my rook would be hanging after c takes. I've given him this huge protected pass pawn on c6. So instead I exchange. That's good. I hope you won. I think a6 was an important nuance that I prepared in similar structures to know to react to the exchange on c6 with a6. Keeps this pawn on c6 somewhat vulnerable and not allowing white to play b5 and then crash through with b5, b6. Yeah, in my preparation for the game, I remember Alireza had a very similar position, but his opponent's king was on g8, which meant that after the exchange, bishop c4 was a threat. That meant that he had to take a timeout. Alireza responded with b5, and he crashed through extremely quickly on the queen side. Here, you can play a6, and white is stuck on the queen side, so the battle reverts to the king side. You can try b5 anyway. And now knight h7, another typical rerouting. We clear the way for the queen. But here, probably more importantly, we want to go knight g5, knight h4 to attack this pawn on f3. And then the knight can jump into h3 as well. Probably bishop d2 is a bit too slow. So he's got a beautiful knight on d5, but it's not actually doing anything. Continue our attack. First of all, attack this pawn on f3. He defended it. And now bishop h3. An unusual way of doing it. Normally trying to keep this bishop for as long as possible, but we've already crashed through, or rather, he's opened up the g file with g3 himself, so we don't need to keep this bishop. Now bishop g2 check is quite a big threat, but the problem is he can't really do anything about it. Bishop f1, we can take it and take the pawn on f3, and if he takes our bishop, then knight takes h3, and those two knights are just far too strong. He's getting mated. So he opted to give the exchange. He can't really take our knight on g2 because we'll be crashing through. I think knight takes e4 check, king f1, knight takes knight, king takes f2, and queen h4 check, and our attack is much too strong. So he played for counterplay. He does have a good knight on d5 after all, and a pass pawn on a5. And that won him the game, sadly, because I messed up. But objectively, this position should be very good for black, just winning. So this knight e3 was the simplest to offer to give back a pawn to get rid of his strong knight. If he takes it, then we'll recapture with a pawn, knight f4, queen g5, and we're still once attacking, and he loses his big pride and joy that's now in d5. And if he moves the bishop, then queen g5 is a strong antidote. You can't take the knight on e6, so we've got mate, queen g2. We can't take the knight is jumping into c5, and we're very active and material up. So that's one that, sorry, I think is everything okay? It's like technical thing there. So yeah, that is one that got away from me. But still, getting winning position as black against number 2 in the world is a good advert for the King's Indian. So I played h5 in this game. I'd come prepared. And we're both blitzing out actually here. I'm getting ready. He played the same plan as Alireza, knight f2 to control the g4 square. And now I think that this is the most flexible move order. The rook might go to f7 if white looks like he's going to enter with a plan of taking the c file and c takes d5 and knight b5. But if he plays another plan, we'll go rook g8 and try and push through g4. So a6. Again, I took. b6 is possible, but there's some craziness here, I remember. With bishop b5 and into c6, knight b5 and taking the pawn on a7 is one plan that's dangerous. Another is I wasn't entirely sure what was happening if white tried to close the position completely with c6 and g4 as an idea. If white can keep it completely closed, then obviously we're suffering from a lack of space with pawns on a6 and c6. Again, the theoretical debate here is not very important unless you're playing a grandmaster, or strong grandmaster, I think. Good question. I'm not sure it is a draw. This is something I was trying to figure out. I can briefly mention it. For example, what I should do, I think, is make sure the position stays open and take this pawn. But this position, I don't think is a draw. Now I'm trying to figure out what. There was some plan that worried me. I think white puts a knight on b5, then brings the second knight to c4. Say knight d3 to b2 to c4. Then brings his bishop around to that diagonal. Say bishop around to f2. Maybe even moves his king and bishop to g1. And eventually he'll take on sacrifice a piece to open up the queen's side, or even sacrifice 2 pieces to open up, and the c and a pawns, I think, decide. I spent a while looking at this kind of structure, and I think I came to the conclusion that this position is probably winning for white, but this position with pawn on b5 is a draw, because white lacks the b5 square, so you can't attack enough pieces here. But still, this isn't why we play the King's Indian, to get a completely blocked up position. So I captured. And I think my original analysis ended somewhere around here. I think c6 was the first move that was where we're both out of book. So our plan is to play g4 once the bishop moves from e2. So for example, if white takes the pawn on a6, then we're ready to throw in g4 immediately, and our attack is coming with a lot of venom. So at the moment, white's pieces are stopping g4, but he's got a knight on f2, bishop on e2, and queen on d1. Those are all rather passive just to stop this break. And we'll get there anyway with bishop h6 and rook g8. So he plays c6. I played rook b8, not really to attack this pawn on b4, although probably I should have taken it. But the main thing was that I didn't want to allow white the plan of bishop takes a6 and bishop b7, attacking our rook. And then I don't really want to exchange those bishops to give a big pass pawn on b7. So I moved the rook. He took. And here the simplest would have been to take this pawn on b4. An exchange, and then start with g4. With knight h4 coming, and there's still a very dangerous attack. I decided to get on with it immediately. Who wants a pawn on b4? I want to mate. He plays very well around here. Exchange, he decided to keep the pawn. I cleared the way for the g file. I want rook g8, knight h4, and then g takes f3 is a big threat, even some knight sacrifice with knight takes g2. So he took knight h4, playing it this way round. Rook g8 again is the idea. with g takes f3 as well to open up the g file. He took on g4 and rook g8. Now g takes h5 is suicidal, opening up the g file. We can take the pawn on g2 with check. So he got off the g file with king h1. I recaptured. And the big threat now is g3, attacking this knight and opening up the g file. If I can exchange off this pawn on g4 for the pawn on h2, then I don't think his king is going to survive long. We've got rook on g8, queen on c8 is looking a bit passive to defend the pawn on c7, but it's just one move away from being a really dangerous attacking piece. The knight on h4, this knight on f6 can join as well with knight h5. Sadly not Mike. Is it already winning? I think during the game I was very optimistic, but Jesper defends this very well. Here's a 2600 Grandmaster. g3 is an important move to stop me being able to play g3 myself. And this is a very interesting position. It's worth thinking about for a while and coming up with some ideas. What I played is interesting. The engine's top is fantastic. Something that I really doubt that any of you will be able to come up with without some silicon help. I should say it's not any long calculating line. It's just a concept. First of all, I should probably say that just dropping the knight back with knight g6 I think is okay. F takes g3 is another obvious move that we need to. We have one correct already, very impressive. F takes g3 is a move that we have to calculate, but I think h takes g3 and we're just leaving out our pieces hanging. It's not quite working out for us. The move that I played sorry, I'm just checking these. Lots of good, interesting moves. There are lots of very good ideas here. I wish I'd had phone a friend here. The move I played was knight f3, as a few people have mentioned in the chat, with the idea of bringing the queen round to h5, mate on h2. The knight is very strong. And white, I think, would be busted really here were it not for knight takes g4, which is a move he played. And we continued the fireworks. But I saw the correct move. Well done, Doug and Theo. Queen e8 is the engine's top move. And Wendy, nice, yeah. A move that I don't think crossed my mind in this precise position. I was looking at ways of sacrificing the knight, but just leaving it there like this. It turns out that this is just a very dangerous attack. White sort of has to take the knight or we'll get a better version of the knight hopping into f3. But now g3 attacks the knight and threatens g2. After h8, rook takes. We might be a piece down, but the most relevant point is this king is very, very vulnerable here. The knight on f2 is not helping at all. It's just getting in the way of the other pieces joining. Another point that crops up here is the knight hanging on c3. It was remarkable the number of variations I was calculating during the game and looking at afterwards where the knight being hanging on c3 was relevant. It didn't look like it should be. But here, yeah, the top computer line is to play rook g1. He doesn't have time to keep this knight. If knight e2, do we already play queen h5? Threaten mate with queen takes h4 check, and have to take the rook. We'll take check, and how are we doing? Are we continuing check? And rook g8 immediately, or queen h4 check. Both look strong. Rook g8 must be the end. We threaten both queen g2 mate and queen h4 mate. I think that white isn't surviving here. And so the computer wants rook g1, when we can actually ignore this knight again with queen g6, bring another piece into the attack. And I think the computer found some only moves to keep this as a draw, but practically I don't think white is going to survive this. Another suggestion I saw that is actually very good is knight h5 as well. The idea of g3, I think, is also one of the engine's top choices. But yeah, already we have lots of good choices, and white has to play extremely accurately not to lose on the spot. My choice was a slightly different knight sacrifice, knight f3. I thought if he does nothing, then at least my knight's going to d4 as well, where it's a very good outpost. He took on g4. Now, if we just recapture, he'll take the knight on f3. He's won a pawn and brought a piece over to the king side, and I couldn't find any way for that to work. But my idea behind knight f3 was my own sacrifice with knight takes h2. When I saw this concept, I thought that I was winning, but I got rather over optimistic here. It's very dangerous, but white should be holding. I think he has to take this knight on h2. King takes h2, then we'll take on g4. Taking either of the bishop on h6 or the knight on f6 is going to allow queen h3 with a huge attack. It has to be taken. Queen h3. And yeah, here I was very optimistic. F takes g3 is one straightforward threat with queen h2, and knight g4 as well. I thought knight g4 and take on g3. He's not going to be able to defend the knight on h2. This is going to be some beautiful mate. But he defends well again with rook f3. And here I choose the wrong capture. I should take with the rook to threaten queen g2 mate. I think that I wasn't entirely sure how to assess queen f1. But again, we see this loose knight drops off on c3. And yeah, I wasn't entirely sure. Material is level, and white's got a big pawn on c6 that's going to be a pass pawn when he takes on c7. But we'll take the pawn on e4, and we have too many threats still with knight g3 check. Pawn at b5 is also hanging. So this is actually winning for black. So he had to play rook a2 to guard the g2 square. Rook g8. Not rushing anything here, just bringing another piece into the attack. And now after the exchange, it's quite important. We've exchanged off one pair of rooks. The attack is still very dangerous with knight g4 coming next. I chose the immediate f takes g3. Rook a2 to defend. And now we see a slight problem compared to the previous variation. White has two rooks defending, and this rook on b8 is not very helpful. It's not helping in my attack. And here, well, first of all, I was a bit too optimistic that things had gone wrong. If I take on c1 immediately, the problem is that the idea with knight g4 doesn't work. It turns out that our king is too weak with queen e1. Can't take the knight with the pawn because our queen is hanging. And taking with the knight, white has rook takes g3. And whichever way we recapture, we're losing our queen. If we take with the rook, then rook takes h2 pins. And and if queen takes, rook takes, and we can't go king g7 because our queen is undefended. This trick saves him everywhere. So I continued without the exchange with knight g4. But now he can take on h6. And again, knight takes h2 fails to this rook takes g3 trick, something that I'd not envisaged when I took on g3 the wrong way. Again, you see if we could have exchanged this rook on b8 for the one on a2, then this attack would be crashing through. But as it is, black is actually lost. Yeah, well, he was thinking, I realized that this position was just completely lost. So I can't take on h2. Objectively, the best move is queen takes h6, but I found the position too depressing after rook takes g3. Again, knight takes h2, just rook takes h2, wins the queen. We can win the exchange, but here I think the two knights and pawn are just too powerful against the rook, and we don't really have any attack, so could try and salvage a draw here, but I decided it was easy for white to play, and white objectively should be winning. So when in that kind of situation, you have to roll the dice. Instead of taking anything, I went queen h4. So I'm 2 pieces down. As you see, I've just blundered a piece with f takes g3 rather than rook takes. But it's still not straightforward for white to convert. We're now ready to take on h2, because rook takes g3 won't attack the queen. So we're in time to move the knight away with a discovered check. What he should play is rook takes g3 anyway, still keeping this trick. It's a move that unfortunately I saw when I played queen h4, but I decided I had to allow it. And after the exchange, I hoped that I might have some magical move here to keep the game alive. Rook h2 is a very important idea. But sadly, king g8, which is what I was hoping for, allows queen takes g4 check and rook g2 next. And white is winning with bishop and knight and pawn for the rook. So rook takes g3 would have won. Sorry, good question, guys. Yeah, rook h4 here, I guess, would be better. But the problem was queen g1. Another complicated position. And after, do we have a draw? I don't think we have a draw here. It does look like the swap and check. Then king g2. You can see why white doesn't play this short on time. For g8 check, yeah, this is the line I was analyzing at the time. Unfortunately, bishop g5 check. And then we're the ones getting mated. There's also f3. So yeah, I really hoped that I would find something in this position. But I realized this one, king g1 again, and I'm going to run out of checks. This rook g8 check being met by bishop g5 check is the key problem. But you never know, maybe I would be able to find one final trick. Sorry, queen f. Queen f3 check, king g1. Hey Falk, I'll answer in a moment. Queen f3 check here, Jakob. Does it make a difference after queen g2? It does feel that somehow there could be something here, but the computer put cold water on the idea. So the exchange and check. Sorry, how were we doing this? King g1. And you wanted rook g8 check, bishop g5, and king g7. So now it's not mate immediately because the f6 square is defended. So this is certainly a better try than the line I was showing. So white has queen h6 to e6. That's probably just a couple of checks. I'm wondering if there's some... Is there some easy way to exchange queens here? Yeah, b6. The problem a lot of the time here is that even if the line I was trying to get to work was to give up this bishop on g5 to exchange queens, because the structure is very bad. How is queen h6 check, king f7, queen e6 check, king g7, queen f5? We can't take the knight on c3 because then queen f6 and queen h6 is mate. And if queen g3 check, king f1, yeah, and rook f8, again, this bishop h6 check. I think that we're going to run out of checks, unfortunately. Okay, let's. There's still plenty in this game, and we're already overrunning, so let's run back. And just to answer your question, sorry, Falk, that the analysis is the same in both the book format and the Chessadble, although the English has been edited by Quality Chess, so that will be better. And I've also written conclusions to every chapter, so that'll be bonus material. It will just be in the books. So here, rook takes g3 was not easy to see, even as we calculate afterwards. But this whole concept of swinging the rook over to h2 was something that I'd not anticipated, and so I really should have exchanged these rooks. Instead, he tried similar with bishop f4. Again, the idea is that knight takes h2, bishop takes g3, and rook takes h2. So the same idea. I captured it. Rook f4. Can you see what sneaky trick I found here that turned the tables? It's actually still 0-0 again now, according to the engine. I switched f4, but practically white was just losing after my move. Yeah, very nice. We have the correct answer. Rook b f8. This is certainly what Jesper missed. Now, we obviously, this game has been extremely complicated, and we're both in quite bad time trouble here. Now, it looked, when he played bishop f4, I'm sure that he was just winning here. G takes h2, I imagine, is the move that he was calculating. When rook takes g4, and this same theme once again, that however I recapture, rook takes h2, wins my queen. Otherwise, he's playing rook takes g4 next move, when he'll be 2 pieces up once again. But yeah, after rook b f8, the problem is that after it doesn't, it's the same line, whether he takes on g4 or he takes on f8 and then plays queen takes g4. You might be 2 pieces up, but rook f1 check, and the final important move, not the hasty queen takes h2 when he can escape with king takes f1, but rook f2 and then take, and then whichever way he goes, it's mate. So he was rather panicked after I played rook f8. Object to the queen f3 was a way to defend. To defend the rook this way. When queen h6, I found was the most challenging move. I think there is another option. I think I can take the knight on h2 now with g takes h2. Does that look plausible? Although rook takes f8, trying to figure out what the... Maybe I don't have a trick. So probably I have to exchange rooks first and then take the knight on h2. I think that is equal. But queen h6 is a move that I wanted to play. And we continue to have craziness. We've got the same theme once again. The queen takes g4 fails to exactly the same mate with rook f1 and rook f2. And he takes pawn on g3. We can still play the checks. White is forced to give up the queen. But this should be a drawn endgame with rook knight and pawn for the queen. Sorry, rook knight and 2 pawns, but his king is too open. It doesn't make a difference. Extra pawn. Instead, he played most logical, check. But now he's got no way of defending the rook. Well, apart from e5, but this doesn't work because the queen is on too bad a square. This is the big difference between queen d4 and queen f3. With queen f3, he had rook takes f8, and he was still covering the f1 square. But now queen e1 check is a huge threat. Tried the check and take, but I can simply recapture. Queen e1 is still a big threat, as is knight f2. And after all that, he's only a pawn up now as well. Queen d1, and now queen h3 was the easy way to do it. Rook f1 is a huge threat, as well as just winning the exchange with knight f2. And so he resigned here. I have a feeling queen h3 might... Let me load it up again. Move was move 39, was it? Sorry, move 37 was queen h3. Okay. So yeah, it was still... The position exploded into life. Well, it was always... I think we were rather short on time, despite the fact that both of us were blitzing out theory, although I was spending a bit of time to make sure. But we certainly had both seemingly prepared up to about this position. It was slightly odd preparation from him, I thought. But here we're on move 19. So by move 19, we still have plenty of time, but I think already by this position, just move 26, we're both below 20 minutes. So I think that this is a very fair advert for the King's Indian. The positions are chaotic, and you're likely to make some big mistakes and the computer laugh at you with these attacks. But practically speaking, it's extremely difficult for white to defend. And you have a lot of fun too. This game was, okay, if I'd lost it and we'd lost the match, it would have been a bit painful, but still enjoyable way of playing chess. And it's exactly, Mike, it's very hard for either side to play accurately. I think it's harder, I think everyone would agree, this is harder to play the white side, because white needs to juggle defending the king side with expanding over on the queen side. Whereas if things go wrong for us over on the queen side, then we can put all our eggs into the mate basket of just throwing everything forward, sacrifice material, and see what happens. And it often pays off, like it did in this game. This was overrun rather, but does anyone have any questions before we finish? You're welcome. I should just break down probably this volume 1 is coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and that will be on the classical variations primarily. So both this Mar del Plata and the Knight PD7 that we started with. And then it's also covering white's other options back in for example, here bishop e3 is the Gligorich variation, and d5 are both covered. Mike, the transpositions, the Retties and Englishes, and the fianchetto variation are all in volume 2 with various other things. So just while I wrap up and H3 here is also a popular line, which is covered in volume 1. And finally, the same-ish variation where white plays with F3. Those are the main things covered in this volume, and everything else will be in volume 2. Thanks, Jonathan. And 552 is the engines certainly have never really liked black's positions, but it's been really interesting going back into these old main lines. For example, the game we just had. I think that the old engines were saying white was basically winning in that position that we got, whereas the modern neural networks much prefer are much more optimistic about black's chances. And so I was thinking it was more or less level, which I think is probably a fair assessment. When I've been working with the engines, I've not been too concerned by +1 evaluation if white doesn't have a plan. A lot of the positions it thinks that, the space is giving a good advantage, but white, especially the weaker engines, we're doing nothing with this white and just sitting on the big space, allowing us our f5, f4, g5, g4, and suddenly it would switch to black winning once they'd calculated the win. I think I'm not sure whether I've used both Stockfish and Leader in these kind of positions. It really depends in the King's Indian on for example, this game of mine against against Jesper. Once we got to the super sharp stuff with the P sacrifices everywhere, then Stockfish will obviously be doing very well. It's very good at calculating. But the actual getting to that position probably is playing more in Leader's style, where it knows where the pieces should go. Which variation did I most struggle with? I think it took me quite a while to know what to do in the fianchetto variations, because the style is quite different. I'm quite happy with what I suggested here, but it was quite hard to find something that gave the right balance between winning chances and being sound. The fianchetto is, I would say that everything I cover in volume 1 is trying to refute the King's Indian. These positions where white grabs a big center and tries to claim the opening is simply bad and that they're going to win by force. Then in volume 2, we're going to see the other ways that white instead tries to be solid and deprive us of counterplay, which I'm happy to say is extremely difficult to achieve. But there are these two different ways of playing. Sorry, someone asked, will the line from Nakamura Grishuk be featured? If someone can remind me how exactly that one went. Mike, the volume 1 will come out first. The finishing, the editing touches of volume 2, and I've just finished the conclusions, so that'll take a bit of time, but hopefully it'll come out quite soon. And Dirk, 5H3 is a very interesting topical line as well, something that I've had a lot of experience with. It became very fashionable, and I've played it with both colors. I think, black has to know what he's doing there. So for that, it can be dangerous. But I believe it's playable. I had some important new concepts that I think makes it very playable for black. Jakob, any updates on the course planned? Nothing immediately, but in general, for the Chessadble course, I've been updating. I've actually done quite a lot of updates because of the questions that I've been asked, getting ready for this course, for the book course. So there are a lot of fresh ideas there that needed dealing with. Probably why the book is so large. But so I'll keep updating that, and then yeah, perhaps there'll be future work in the pipeline as well. And thanks, Jonathan. There are a lot of good courses though, so I was very happy to be shortlisted on that. Bishop e2. So the Nakamura Grishuk was Bishop e2, Bishop e3, and h4. Oh yes, sorry. I remember the game now. It's Nakamura Grishuk. Yeah, I had. It was covered. Grishuk deviated from my analysis with a bad move, and then got into trouble. But I think that the line is completely fine for black. But of course, something that's sharp. And, yeah, Berlin Grand Prix sounds right. Yeah, I was excited to see a King's Indian, but sadly it didn't quite work out. I think, yeah, Grishuk played. I wanted the knight to hop into g3, I seem to remember, and he played a bit too slowly. And yeah, Nakamura did extremely well there, and very impressive after a break of a couple of years from classical chess, although of course he's playing speed chess every day with his streaming. But it's looking like it'll be a very exciting finish. And well, this one's not finished yet. Exciting day tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow that we'll see the tie breaks. Anyway, thanks a lot, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, if you have any questions, please get in touch. I'll try and reply to them as soon as I can. I should go and check on my daughter now. Good night, everyone. Thanks a lot. I hope to see you all soon. Bye.